Thank you very much, John and Annalisa. Annalisa, if I could ask you to... So very, very insightful discussion. Thank you so much. And now it's time for those really sharp and penetrating questions that John mentioned, which can be directed over there as well, I guess. So what we'll do is we'll take a round of questions. We'll maybe do 3 first, and then I'll check to see if there are any online or virtual questions. So why don't I start right ahead?
Dan Norrell from World Vision. My question is around asset accumulation of cash versus vouchers versus food. One of the arguments that have been made for cash is that people will use that cash to buy capital assets, animals, equipment, to be able to then graduate from that assistance. Was there any indication in the data on that? And then secondly, what was the expectation of the households beyond the time period? Were they going to continue to receive assistance, or was this something that they felt they needed to, as you said, buy a lot of kilos of sorghum to be able to go beyond the time period?
Thank you very much, Dan. And just a reminder, you introduced yourself, which was lovely. So if everyone could introduce themselves when they stand up for the benefit of everyone else and online. We'll do 3. So there was a question here.
Antonio Galloso, U.S. Agency for International Development. I noticed that some of the cash, you made the point of identifying when the cash was given to male members of the family and in other cases to females. Did you explore any difference in the use of the cash by different genders? Because in my experience, if you gave the money to males, they drank it.
Thank you. Third question will go right up here.
Nusrat Ahmed from IFPRI. I have just a clarification. You're only looking at WFP programs. You're not looking at programs which are run by government, because there is this whole element of leakages of these programs when cash is transferred. And secondly, have you looked at tension between households which are receiving these food transfers and households which are not receiving? Because there is some evidence that there are some tensions between those two. And the whole question of sustainability, how do you look at that? Because the program, obviously these programs cannot be run over a long period of time without, doling cash out from institutions like the WFP. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll start with that round of questions on asset accumulation, differences between cash to male or females in a household, and then a 3-part question on WFP program versus government programs, the tensions between those who receive the transfers and don't, and then sustainability.
Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'm actually going to start off by making some general remarks, and then if my colleagues who worked on the individual studies want to chime in, they are more than welcome to. And for the 5 of you, that was a hint. On the differences between male and female-headed households, in a number of the studies, we did explore the differences. Sorry, let me start again. If you truly wanted to get at the difference between impacts in terms of the gender control of the transfers, you'd want a slightly different study. You'd want to randomize the gender of the person within the household to receive the transfer. We don't do that in this intervention. We randomize the type of modality across transfers. So our ability to answer that question is confined to seeing whether or not households where the recipient is a male behave differently from a household where the recipient was a female. And my recollection, by and large, is we do not see big differences at the level of male or female headship. One issue in that, one of the reasons why we may not see that is that the study wasn't designed to have sufficient statistical power to detect that. So difference could exist, but we just don't have sample sizes large enough to do so. But again, it's worth reiterating that in Uganda and in Yemen, where we looked at this, the purchase of these various types of intoxicants, we found very little evidence that that was occurring, which gives us at least some confidence that in fact these cash transfers were not being misused. It's true, you're right, that with this particular study with WFP, it's a very tight design. There was a great deal of emphasis put on making sure the intervention worked the way it was supposed to. But we perceive that to be a desirable feature of this evaluation, that we want to answer one question really, really well, and that's the relative effects of these types of transfers, which is why, and my team should correct me, we do not have a lot of information on things like tensions across beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries. Okay, I think there's a little bit we might be able to say, but not a lot. It was fairly clear to people that they should have no expectation that the transfers would continue after the evaluation was over. That was something which was made clear to people at the outset. And that then speaks to I think actually the very first question and the very last question about asset accumulation and sustainability. And again, I hope my colleagues can provide more details on the asset accumulation. In some cases, for example, in Niger, we do see some evidence that households that received cash relative to those households that received food were more likely to do things like buy agricultural inputs for the upcoming cropping season, suggesting that those households that receive cash are using some of that for further income generation rather than for immediate consumption. Having said that, I think oftentimes there are too high expectations put on these types of transfer programs. And the phrases people often use are phrases like graduation or sustainability of programs. If you look at the United States, for example, there has been some program to provide resources to poor people, whether it's currently SNAP, it used to be called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. There were other program names before, and those go back at least 40 or 50 years, and arguably in some things like Medicare or Medicaid, go back even farther. So in the context of developed countries, our standard is we think it's appropriate that countries take care of their poorest citizens. But then in the context of developing countries, we say, hey, that standard doesn't apply to you guys. We're going to give you $20, and why haven't you graduated from poverty? That seems to me, and to put it charitably, that's an unrealistic expectation. One of the features that I think we've observed within IFPRI over the years in which we focused on social protection is a process by which there was initially a great deal of skepticism about these types of interventions, that they would provide anything of any value. So one where acceptance, in fact, they actually do prove to be powerful at meeting certain terms of welfare outcomes, to ones where sometimes, in fact, we expect them to do absolutely everything. And if there was a risk early on that they would be shut down or stopped because there was this hypercritical atmosphere now, I perceive that there's the opposite risk now, that too many hopes are being poured into them. But with that, and perhaps the team would like to amplify on a couple of these points.
The mic, hold on a second, Sue.
Hi, this is Shalini. I just wanted to add a quick note on the asset accumulation. As John noted, the time period for the intervention, I worked on the Uganda case study. It was 12 months with 6 transfer cycles, each of which was about $10. And usually what you find is because asset purchases are lumpy, you just wouldn't expect to find purchases that quickly. What we did look at was whether the transfers themselves were used differently. So the food transfers, as John noted, they were not sold, but they also were, at least in Uganda, about 97% consumed with almost none saved. By contrast with the cash transfers, about 50% was spent on food. About 16% was saved. And that was, we basically asked, did you save it to use it beyond the next 2 weeks? Which suggests that they were using it for what you might think of as building resilience. And then beyond that, we also have, as John noted, some results on early childhood development, which is what you might think of as a human capital investment. We find not just kind of the improvements in diet, which John mentioned. We find increases in consumption of meat and dairy among young children, which is kind of the nutrition investment. We also find that parents invest a great deal in improving the preschools themselves. And so you might think of that broadly as investing in kind of the human capital side. And we don't find that actually at all from the food transfers.
Thank you. Annalisa, did you have anything you wanted to?
I was going to add something just on Ecuador as well, related to what Shalini said. I'm Melissa, and I worked on the Ecuador study, is that we also found that most of the transfer was being consumed and very little saved. So we didn't actually, look at asset accumulation per se, but we didn't expect there to be much with these transfers that were just for 6 months.
What I would like to add is that, as John explained, the purpose and the objective of these studies were really to compare the effectiveness or the impact of the different transfer modalities. But just recently, a couple of weeks ago, WFP, in partnership with the UNHCR, has just issued 8 country studies that they are more of qualitative nature, in which we looked at the impact with regard to gender, with regard to social dynamics and other behavioral of beneficiaries receiving cash, voucher, or in kind. And perhaps although of it is a qualitative study, it is quite interesting to see how cash transfer or voucher transfer can support for instance, reintegration into the society or into the community of beneficiaries that due to poverty, they were somehow excluded, or how we can't really say that cash is empowering women, also because these programs, they tend to run for a relatively small period of time, so we don't really have sufficient evidence whether there is empowerment or not. But for sure, it can be an element that can play in favor of the empowerment of women, but can also play against the women. It really very much depends on the context and how the program is designed. And we can give you the link to this other study, which is quite interesting.
Thank you very much, Annalisa. Now, I know we have a couple in-room questions, but the virtual world is buzzing, so we'll start with the first 3 online ones for this round.
We have a question from Twitter from Twitter user KL Weeks, and she asks, how did you decide to have a control group in some food insecure communities with no cash, voucher, or food? Was there an IRB? And her second question asks, can WFP describe how the cash voucher affordability findings might influence or not current purchase for progress plans? And the third question comes from Twitter user Yashodun, and he asks, how reliable are stated preferences for cash versus food of recipients? They may be resistant to change, even a bad modality they're used to.
Okay, so those 3 questions on control group and IRB, the affordability of cash voucher findings, and the reliability of the stated preferences. Annalisa, do you want to go first this time? Okay.
John? Yeah.
Okay, so I'll be a little more brief this time. First of all, there was an IRB which reviewed all 4 studies for precisely the ethical concerns the online interlocutor is suggesting. In terms of the ability to have pure control groups, this was dependent largely on the characteristics of the various intervention sites. In Uganda, and particularly in Ecuador, the resources available to provide the transfers were not sufficient to cover the entire area that was targeted for the population. In that circumstance where, in effect, everyone is equally deserving, but there are not adequate resources for everyone, the randomization in some sense was a fair allocation mechanism. In Niger and Yemen, the nature of the localities in which we were working did not permit the inclusion of a pure control group. The question about stated preferences and their reliability is a good one. I think it underpins some caution when looking at, for example, people who received cash, and then they would then say, we would like to receive cash in the future. But in turn, it suggests again that the information content in those preferences lies amongst those people who say, well, although I received this type of modality, going forward, I would have actually preferred to receive something else.
I would like to take in particular the second question, where there is the reference to the cash and voucher and the P4P. We think that these two transfer modalities or these two types of programs are not competing with each other, but they actually have the potential to complement each other. Basically, and I would like for a moment also to refer to the part of the presentation in which John was talking about costing. WFP typical way to fund its program is to have operations that are approved, and then once they are approved, we go out to mobilize funding. And those fundings, they do not come immediately. They come over time. And sometimes we are able to receive resources and it is not the right time to buy food. Food is particularly expensive at that point in time. But if we do not buy food at that particular point in time, we have a pipeline break. We are not able to provide the resources to the beneficiaries. So we are compelled to buy food at a price that at that moment is particularly high in order to avoid a pipeline break with regard to the beneficiaries. But now we have a mechanism in place that we are going to use more and more, that is to buy food ahead of time when the price on the market is particularly low, and we can store that food somewhere, and then it will be used for operations at the moment that they need those particular commodities. So we have also to consider that WFP is very conscious about improving the cost efficiency of its in-kind assistance, whether this is by using P4P or using other form of local and regional procurement or also international procurement. This being said, as John pointed out, those studies were undertaken at the moment in which WFP cash and voucher portfolio was relatively small. Now it is much bigger. Now we know much more about how to procure the goods and services, the financial services. And it is also true that over time we will be able also to reduce the cost of these transfer modalities. So I think that we are really entering a period in which not only we have different tools with different transfer modalities, but we will be in a better position to make those different transfer modalities, including in-kind food transfer, more cost efficient.
Thank you. And I know we do have more online questions, but we'll revert back to the room. And Sue will start up front. Shengen, did you have a question?
Well, thank you, Annalisa and John. Let me first thank WFP for opening up your chest to a research organization like IFPRI to look at your programs, whether it has worked, whether it has not worked, which modalities can further improve your effectiveness. I think you serve a great model for many development agencies. So I said the same thing to your ED when I was in Rome about a month ago. Now my question to you is, this study has some limitations. One is obviously the sample size, as John mentioned. So if we increase the sample size, so do you think some of the results will be changed? That's probably the question to John. The second is the time frame. As I understand correctly, it's a one-time intervention, right? It's $45 or cash transfer or how many kgs of food. So if we wanted to continue this intervention every month, right? Let's say for 1 year or 2 years, do you think your results still stand? Particularly some of the behaviors or some of the preferences of cash versus food, whether the food security score will be changed. So we always try to think of the scalability, when we have done some studies. So I really hope if we don't have a good answer, then probably WFP can think of expanding the study to do this. One is the sample size, the other is to look at the longer term interventions instead of one time.
There's a question at the far back of the room.
Dudik Ayosa from George Washington University, former food aid manager at USAID. I just have one question. Food aid programs, whether it's food aid or cash, can distort the local market. And from what I understand of the study, when you were looking at the costs, you were not looking at whether people who got cash and their purchases raised the price of the market, or people who receive food and the availability of food. So all those external factors are completely not included in the study.
Thank you. And far, far back, Simone. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Leo-Perhori, and I'm with the Medill National Security Journalism Initiative. My question pertains to kind of the setup for the cases. I was just wondering why you had at least 2 comparison countries for the direct cash transfers and the direct food transfers, but only one for vouchers, because it kind of reflects a possible bias towards vouchers.
Okay, we'll start with those 3. First on the limitations of the study and if the results would change if scaled up or continued longer than done. Distortion of local markets, and then the design, the country choices.
Okay, so to work through those, we have a 5th country, which we did not report on today. Which is Bangladesh, which started after this main study that we're doing in close collaboration with WFP's country office there. And it's designed to address precisely the concerns you raised. The sample sizes are much larger. The total sample across all different beneficiary groups and controls is something on the order of 5,000 households. It's an intervention that will run for 24 months. The reason for that is for precisely some of the points you are alluding to. We want to see whether or not, in fact, long-term behaviors differ from short-term behaviors. We want to try and get a better handle on the impact on anthropometric indicators, which in a 6-month, for example, transfer cycle are unlikely to emerge. And also one of the things we're curious about is the following notion. That a feature of the vouchers in Ecuador is this notion, in effect, of compulsion, of basically saying we're going to make people actually eat foods which are good for them by restricting the types of foods which they can use with these vouchers. It would be interesting is to see whether or not, in fact, instead of compulsion, we could actually provide education, okay, particularly around feeding of young children, but more generally about nutritious diets. So in the Bangladesh study, not only is there a cash treatment arm, or a set of households which are randomized to receive cash, but there's a second set of households which are randomized to receive cash and also to receive very intensive behavior communication change around the items that I just described. And so one of the things we're very curious about is, first of all, whether or not those things have differential effects. So you could imagine that cash, as opposed to having nothing, might improve food, let's say the diversity of people's diet. But does the behavior communications change actually give you an additional effect over and above that? And then is the cost of actually providing that, what is that cost relative to that increase in benefit? So that, we hope, will actually address those particular concerns. On the question about market distortions, you're absolutely right that this is an area of concern whenever either cash or food are provided as transfer modalities. We cannot address this directly in the study. If you wanted to look at the distortionary effects of cash or food on markets, then your unit of randomization should be a market, as opposed to households within particular localities. So we need to be very clear at the outset that we cannot answer this definitively. What we can say is we did monitor food prices in both localities receiving cash and localities receiving food, or in the Ecuador case, vouchers. And we saw no differential changes across those localities, suggesting to us that those distortionary effects were unlikely to have occurred. It's also worth noting that, again, that may also reflect the relative to the local markets, the relatively small scale of the interventions, okay? And also the relatively short duration. And so something done on a much larger scale might actually have these differential effects, but that's not something we can address. And the final question, which is why only vouchers in one country? And that just reflected our ability to actually implement that particular type of modality. Vouchers really require a relatively well-developed market sector, and also the physical ability to actually ensure that the participants in the voucher scheme can be paid relatively quickly when they receive those vouchers. In Niger, for example, we were working approximately 400 kilometers from the capital city with very poor communications, where in fact the roads were unsafe to travel, and in fact the staff had to actually fly in and out of the survey locality. And so the idea of providing vouchers in that type of setting was just clearly going to be a non-starter. But you're also right that in fact that we need to be a little cautious about what we say on vouchers, given that in fact we only have this one study, one component. We only have vouchers in one of our 4 country studies.
Just a couple of things. We wanted to learn as much as possible, and we set up these studies precisely because of that. But then we have also the reality that we have to face, and we can't really always undertake studies when we are providing life-saving assistance. And I'm referring particularly to an operation that is at a large scale and most likely, unfortunately, will go on for quite some time. That is the Syria crisis, where indeed we could have very interesting studies, but perhaps the setup and what is going on is not really conducive to have this type of studies. So we have always to have trade-offs between what we want to know more and what we want to learn with the reason why we are doing what we are doing. With regard to the market prices, in the real world of our operations, we try to monitor very seriously the market, and we have already in WFP developed a business process that we call the hybrid, which will allow us to shift from market-based to in-kind back to market-based according to the behavior of the market, looking at supply, looking at prices, in order to provide the assistance to our beneficiaries without creating any distortion and any harm to those that they are not beneficiaries.
By the way, I have a research program. Okay.
Right. Thank you. So I'm mindful of the time. We can take 2 more questions, one of which will be an online question, and I know we had another one on the side. But I don't know if John, Annalisa, you'd be available to stick around for a few minutes afterward, as well as perhaps members of the team, to answer any other questions that you may have. But for right now, because of the time, we'll take 2, and we'll start in the room and then go online.
My name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a consultant. Early in your presentation, you had a reference to the importance of keeping ideological and political influences out of the equation. So my question is, did you have any ideological and political influences while you were trying to conduct the study? And on a practical level, what is the practical effect of those influences if you're unable to control them?
This last question comes from Twitter user V Santoso, and she asked, is there a difference in success of delivering the transfers other than the cost difference?
Okay, so John and Annalisa, do you want to tackle those two on political and ideological influences and the success of the various transfers?
Okay, I think I'll take the second one first. The second one just allows us to reiterate some of the core findings on the impacts, that we observe differential impacts in different contexts. In general, we observe greater improvements in the quality of diets as measured by the food consumption score when households receive cash, but that doesn't occur everywhere. Similarly, by and large, we observe larger effects on caloric acquisition when households receive food, but again, that does not occur everywhere. On the other question, though, about politics and ideology, I think one of the great delights about working with WFP on this study is they scrupulously kept themselves apart from the impact evaluation work, and in effect let the data and results speak for themselves. The larger point we wanted to make, though, is the following, is that when we observe discussions around food assistance, either in the United States, with European partners, or at organizations like WFP, what strikes us over and over again are very strong statements made by relatively senior individuals in various organizations. And these statements are often made in an uncategorical fashion, such as, we know cash is always better than food, or we always know that people prefer to receive food than cash. And given the position of these individuals and the forcefulness with which they make them, a statement of opinion is perceived or taken as a statement of fact. We do not think that's actually healthy for programmatic decisions, which we perceive should be much more evidence-based. And so the argument we want to advance in the more general sense is this view that, in fact, it is actually possible to construct a robust evidence base that gives you a much stronger sense of under what conditions which modality is most appropriate.
Yeah, and with that, I would like also to say that, yes, cost is an important component of any intervention. However, we have to differentiate between the cost to deliver outputs and the cost to deliver outcomes. And therefore, we may have situations where delivering cash or vouchers is more expensive than delivering in kind. But if we see that the outcome, the results that we are going to achieve is by far greater than the outcome that we will achieve with in kind, we have to look at that cost rather than the cost of delivering the output, and vice versa. Therefore, cost is important, but we have really to make the difference between is it important just how much it costs for us to deliver, or is it important how much it costs for us to achieve a certain result?
Thank you. So I would like to thank everyone for your questions and for the lively discussion. Also thank John and Annalisa for presenting, and the rest of the study team as well, and I hope you'll join me in a round of applause. Thank you very much.